In 1940, the Italian Navy looked invincible. Its fleet of brand-new, lightning-fast battleships dwarfed the aging British force in the Mediterranean. Benito Mussolini confidently declared the sea, Mare Nostrum, our sea. Yet, just a few months later, half of his battleship fleet lay sunk or crippled at the bottom of their own harbor, taken out not by a rival fleet, but by a handful of fabric-covered biplanes that looked like they belonged in a museum. Welcome to 10-Minute History. I'm your host, Jake Sullivan, and today we're diving into the battle that made the D-Day landings possible, the forgotten fight for the Mediterranean Sea. Many think of this as a sideshow to the main events of World War II, but it was here, on these ancient waters and in the North African desert, that the Western Allies first learned how to win. This was a 6-year struggle for control of Britain's imperial lifeline, the oil fields of the Middle East, and what Winston Churchill famously called the soft underbelly of Europe. When Italy entered the war in June 1940, its navy, the Regia Marina, seemed poised for a swift victory. They had more ships, faster ships, and they were fighting in their own backyard. Their strategy was to sever Britain's lifeline through the Suez Canal, forcing all British ships on the long, time-consuming journey around Africa. But this confidence was built on a series of fatal flaws. In a decision that would haunt them, the Italians had built no aircraft carriers, believing Italy itself was an unsinkable carrier. This meant their fleet could never operate far from land-based air cover, which was often unreliable. They were critically short on fuel, forcing their admirals to be cautious. And, most importantly, they had no radar, rendering them blind at night and in bad weather. The British Royal Navy, under the aggressive Admiral Andrew Browne Cunningham, was numerically inferior. But it had 3 secret weapons. First, the aircraft carrier. Second, radar. And third, an unshakable, Nelson-inspired doctrine to seek out and destroy the enemy. The first major clash at the Battle of Calabria was a draw, but it showed the British would not be intimidated. Then, on the night of November 11, 1940, Cunningham unleashed his masterstroke, Operation Judgment. From the deck of the carrier HMS Illustrious, 21 Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers took off. These slow, obsolete-looking biplanes flew directly into the heavily defended Italian naval base at Taranto. Braving a storm of anti-aircraft fire, they skimmed low over the water and launched their torpedoes. The result was a catastrophe for the Italian Navy. In 90 minutes, 3 of their 6 battleships were hit. 2 were put out of action for months, and 1, the Conte di Cavour, would never return to service. With the loss of just 2 aircraft, the Royal Navy had halved the Italian battle fleet and seized naval supremacy. Taranto was a revolution in naval warfare, proving that air power could defeat a fleet in its own fortress. It was a lesson the Japanese studied very closely for their own future plans at Pearl Harbor. Just 4 months later, in March 1941, the British landed another devastating blow at the Battle of Cape Matapan. Thanks to intelligence from the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, Admiral Cunningham knew the exact details of an Italian plan to attack British convoys. He set a trap. After an initial skirmish, an Italian heavy cruiser, the Pola, was crippled by an aerial torpedo and left dead in the water as night fell. The Italian admiral, unaware that Cunningham's main fleet was nearby, sent 2 more heavy cruisers and their destroyer escorts back to help. Steaming into the darkness, the Italian ships were completely blind. Guided by radar, the British battleships closed to point-blank range undetected. Suddenly, searchlights blazed, and a storm of 15-inch shells obliterated the unsuspecting cruisers. It was a brutal, one-sided massacre. Italy lost 3 heavy cruisers, 2 destroyers, and over 2,300 sailors. The Royal Navy suffered no casualties. After Matapan, the Italian surface fleet would never again willingly challenge the British in open battle. But just as the British seemed triumphant, the entire war in the Mediterranean was turned upside down. Concerned by his allies' failures, Adolf Hitler intervened. He sent the legendary Erwin Rommel and his Afrika Korps to North Africa, and, more ominously for the Navy, he sent the Fliegerkorps 10 to Sicily. This was an elite anti-shipping air corps of the Luftwaffe, armed with deadly Stuka dive bombers. Their impact was immediate and terrifying. In January 1941, HMS Illustrious, the hero of Taranto, was hit by 6 bombs in a ferocious air attack. She barely survived, limping into Malta's Grand Harbor a blazing wreck. This was a grim preview of what was to come. In the spring, the Germans invaded Greece and then launched an audacious airborne assault on the island of Crete. The Royal Navy was tasked with preventing a German seaborne invasion, forcing them to operate under the constant fury of the Luftwaffe without air cover of their own. The waters around Crete became known as Bomb Alley. The Navy succeeded in its mission, but the cost was horrific. 3 cruisers and 6 destroyers were sunk, and 2 battleships and an aircraft carrier were heavily damaged. When some suggested abandoning the army on Crete to save the ships, Cunningham gave his famous reply, "It takes 3 years to build a ship. It takes 3 centuries to build a tradition. The army must be withdrawn." The Mediterranean fleet was shattered, but its honor was intact. With Crete taken, the Axis turned their full attention to the linchpin of the entire Mediterranean, the tiny island of Malta. Just 60 miles from Sicily, Malta was Britain's Unsinkable aircraft carrier. From its airfields, British planes and submarines could attack the vital convoys supplying Rommel's army in Africa. If Malta fell, Rommel's supply line would be secure and Egypt would be lost. For the next 18 months, Malta was subjected to one of the most intense bombing campaigns in history. The key to its survival was the sea. A series of desperate, incredibly costly convoys fought their way to the island against a gauntlet of submarines, aircraft, and mines. By the summer of 1942, Malta was on the brink of starvation and surrender. With Malta neutralized, almost 100% of the supplies sent to Rommel were getting through, allowing him to push deep into Egypt to the gates of Alexandria. In August, the Allies launched Operation Pedestal, the largest and most desperate convoy of the war to save the island. The escort was immense, including 4 aircraft carriers. But the battle was brutal. The carrier HMS Eagle was sunk by a U-boat. Another carrier was crippled. Merchant ships were sunk one by one. The centerpiece of the convoy was the American tanker SS Ohio carrying the jet fuel the island's Spitfires desperately needed. The Ohio was torpedoed, bombed, set on fire, and a crashing plane even hit her deck. Dead in the water and sinking, her crew refused to abandon her. In a legendary feat of seamanship, destroyers were lashed to her broken hull, literally dragging and pushing the wreck the final miles into Malta's Grand Harbor. Of 14 merchant ships, only 5 made it. But it was enough. The Ohio's fuel allowed Malta's Air Force to fly again. The island was back in the fight, just in time to once again strangle Rommel's supply lines during the decisive Battle of El Alamein. The sacrifice of Operation Pedestal had saved Malta, and in doing so turned the tide of the war. Soon after, a new, decisive force entered the Mediterranean, the United States. In November 1942, in the largest amphibious operation in history at that time, American and British forces, under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, landed in French-held Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. The Germans reacted with lightning speed, pouring troops into Tunisia, and the Allies found themselves in a bitter 6-month campaign. The inexperienced American forces suffered a humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass, but they learned their lessons quickly. Now, the Axis armies were caught in a giant vice, with Montgomery's 8th Army advancing from the east after their victory at El Alamein, and Eisenhower's forces pushing from the west. As the land battle reached its climax, Admiral Cunningham initiated Operation Retribution, a total naval and air blockade of the Tunisian coast. "Sink, burn, and destroy," his orders read. "Let nothing pass." The Sicilian Narrows became a death trap. In May 1943, the Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. Over 275,000 veteran German and Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, a disaster on the scale of Stalingrad. The victory was a massive turning point. For the first time since 1940, the Mediterranean was open to Allied shipping, freeing up millions of tons of capacity for the war effort. And most importantly, the Allies now possessed a secure springboard for the invasion of Italy and the assault on Europe's soft underbelly. In July 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. The campaign had a decisive political effect. Facing defeat, the fascist Grand Council in Rome deposed and arrested Mussolini. On September 8th, Italy officially surrendered. The Italian battle fleet, the enemy the Royal Navy had fought for 3 long years, sailed to Malta to surrender. As he watched the Italian battleships steam into the Grand Harbor, Admiral Cunningham sent a triumphant, historic message to London. Be pleased to inform their lordships that the Italian battle fleet now lies at anchor under the guns of the fortress of Malta. The battle for the Mediterranean was effectively over. The campaign in Italy would become a long, bloody slog, but the sea was now an Allied lake. So why was this long, costly campaign so important? The fight in the Mediterranean was the essential prerequisite for the final victory in Europe. It forced Germany to divert nearly 1 million men and dozens of its best divisions away from the Russian front and the defense of France. Without this, the D-Day landings in 1944 would have faced a much stronger German army, and their success would have been far from certain. This was the crucible where the inexperienced American and British armies learned how to fight together, forging the alliance that would liberate Europe. It proved that modern wars are won by logistics and technology just as much as by battlefield courage. Control of the sea, powered by air power, radar, and intelligence, was the key that unlocked the door to Fortress Europe. It was not a sideshow. It was the necessary war. So what are your thoughts on this? Let us know down in the comments below. If you found this interesting or learned something new, please give this video a like and don't forget to subscribe to 10-Minute History for more deep dives. Thanks for listening.